Yeah, just move that speed. Put behind, so.
Hi, Brian. So I'm just going to do this paper by Catherine Tammy's The Munders group, um, which I prepped really quickly, so it's quite text heavy. But I thought it would be interesting because it's looking at home audio recordings, although they've coded them from video, similar to us, but they've looked at the background sounds in relation to how much the infants and the mums are vocalizing, so kind of a different um, focus than most of us, all of us. And they've also, which I think is pretty interesting, they've done it on two samples. So they've done it on an English speaking higher socioeconomic class sample, and then a Spanish speaking lower socioeconomic class sample separately and then together, which I think is a pretty nice analysis. So they've taken infants, and gone into their homes basically and taken 1 to 2 hour video recordings twice in 1 week in the English speaking sample and only once in the Spanish speaking sample. I'm not sure if they say why in the paper. So most of the days they got 1 and 2. I think maybe they didn't code the Spanish sample. And then yeah, pretty much the same as us. Um, Visits were scheduled when infants were alert, um, and then a similar time of day. And then they were looking at whether the kind of background noise was stable between the two visits. Mothers were instructed to ignore the experimenters. So unlike us, they stayed with the equipment. And then they coded for 5 types of background sounds, so traffic construction, appliances, music, communication devices, and television screens. So the television or screen were pre-recorded programs, and then the communication devices were live sounds, no matter on what device it was. And then they also had a sixth category, which was multiple sounds together, which is different from how we do our vocal coding. We still would code all of the different categories in our vocal coding. They researcher coded the video using DataView, and they just segmented each video into 10-second interviews, and they did ones and zeros whether each sound was present. And they didn't code muted television screens. And then I think this means they didn't code muted interactive toys that make sounds or play songs. And then they didn't code infant generated sounds. And their inter-rater reliability was quite high for everything that they did, actually. Then they also did a follow-up pass. So for intervals that had sounds from televisions or screens, they looked at whether the infants and the mothers were looking at the television screen separately or together. They coded whether the show was child-directed, adult-directed, or other. And they coded whether the mother taught about the show at any point. And then with the music samples, they looked at whether the mum sang along or played the music on an instrument, and they also coded whether the song was child-directed and whether the song had lyrics.
Sorry, Emily, I'm not sure I missed it, but they didn't differentiate between the type of screen.
Pardon?
They didn't differentiate between like looking at television on a television, then looking at television on like a mobile phone.
It doesn't seem so, no.
No.
Yeah, so television screen, pre-recorded programs that could also be played on tablets or cell phones. So it seems to be more about how they are accessing the type of media they're accessing rather than the device that it's on.
Just kind of thought it should be like quite a big difference between how you engage with like a television versus like CoComelon on your mobile.
Yeah, whether you're there playing a game. I mean, the
Yeah.
television, I guess that yeah, the infants are quite small, but they don't actually say anything at all about whether they're playing video games or not.
Yeah, but it's even like you can watch like, like watch stuff on your phone and then watch stuff on a TV. And if they
Yeah.
had it in their phone, like in their pram, then it's like they can like interact with it. Where if it's on a TV, then it's like, yeah, that's what I was thinking. But
Yeah, I mean, they haven't made that distinction, so I don't know why they haven't spoken about that at all. So whether it didn't happen or not, I don't know. But yeah, good point. Okay. So yeah, this was just the English speaking participants, 36 infants. So they transcribed and recorded mother's speech to infants in DataView at the utterance level. I haven't looked at what this is, like how in depth they've done the mother coding, but I don't think they've done it in a lot of depth. And similarly with the infant coding, they just say non-distress vocalizations were also annotated. I think that they've just recorded whether there were or weren't, and they might have timestamped them as well. Sound times input. Okay. Yeah, so for every 10-second interval, you had the background sound, whether the infant vocalized and whether the mum spoke to her infant. And then I think they only looked at the contents of the mother vocalizations in the segments that were had the TV and music to see if she was articulating about the TV or she was singing along with the music. They also did this decibel meter. And they kind of make the point that because it was in a central location and participants were asked to stay away from it, that it wasn't recording the decibel in the ear range of the child. It was just recording the kind of ambient noise. I know that we talked a lot about doing that. They didn't make many soundings from the decibel. So for each 10-second interval, they had for the mother and for the infant, whether there was a background sound or not, and whether there was speech or not. I remember when I coded the Lev's vocal data that we used to code whether there was background noise or not, but I don't think that we've done that for the Anaxa data.
Yeah, we do have that.
Oh, do we?
Yeah.
Oh, that's nice. I mean, yeah, okay, that's good. So we could do something like this then maybe. So this I think is pretty cool. It shows the timelines of the background sound exposure for both of the two visits. So the visits were on average 5 days apart.
So, sorry, just on that, that's for the qualitative Anaxa home recordings, yeah? But that's only been done from the point of view, is it clean? Are we getting a clean vocal signal, or what's that been done for?
Yeah. Just whether it's clean or not. Yeah. Same as with our tabletop play data. Yes, we don't know what sounds are occurring.
So that's the same as we did for the speech brain tracking stuff. That was the same idea, even though it's the home data.
Yeah. But I did get Sydney. Do you remember that intern? Because I was validating that model that Thomas sent to us. And I did get her to code for like what background noises it was. So we have got that analysed for like 10 or so.
And yeah, okay.
I guess we would only have the background noise where there's a vocalization. We wouldn't have like these guys, whether there's a background noise and no vocalization, would we?
But in the ones that Sydney did, she actually just coded like I can't remember, I think maybe I did 5-second intervals, like what sounds were occurring. But yeah, but for the rest, for the vocal coding, then no, we just have it when a vocalization is occurring, yeah.
Okay, cool. So this is the first analysis for the English speaking sample. So ordered from at the bottom infants who were exposed to the least amounts of background sounds to infants who were exposed to the most. They say that the level of sounds were quite stable from visit 1 or visit 2, but I'm not clear on whether each line is per individual infants across the two figures, or if they've just done it on the percentage of sound. They make in their discussion quite a big point, which seems valid, about the variability in the amount of sounds that infants are exposed to and the variability of sounds within that. But in the English speaking sample, music was the most prevalent sound, which is blue, I think, although there's still quite a lot of variability within that. all infants were exposed to sounds from appliances, but only for 5% of intervals. 32 infants were exposed to transportation and construction sounds, but only for an average of 8%. 24 were exposed to communication devices, although such sounds were brief. And the fewest number of infants were exposed to television screen sounds for an average of 10% of infants. Like whether that's to do with the fact that somebody is videoing them or not, I don't know, we can maybe discuss that later. And then 32 infants were exposed to multiple sounds.
But they shouldn't necessarily add up to 100, right? They were non-exclusive, these categories.
Mm,
So they forced it to add up to 100, but sometimes it would add up to more than that. Yeah.
yeah, I don't know. And then they say that on average, infants were exposed to background sounds about half of intervals. The overall frequency was stable. Yep. And decibel data ranged from 61.2 to 77. I think we used to set our James's beeps at 63 decibels, which is about the sound of a conversation, or normal spoken conversation. And they say that anything above 85 is damaging. Okay, so when they did the exploratory analysis of the television, television screens primarily were children's shows, followed by adult-directed shows, and then commercials. For those who had television screens present, mothers watched television screens about half of the time. Infants watched just over half of the time, and they watched together for just under 40% of the time. Music was generally child-directed, with lyrics, and mothers sang along occasionally and rarely played instruments or musical toys in this sample. Okay, so this is the grids of the number of vocalizations and background sounds. So sample 1 is the English-speaking sample, and sample 2 is the Spanish-speaking sample. But remember, in the Spanish-speaking sample, they only coded 1 hour rather than 2, which I think will account for some of the differences in the sounds. So overall, in the English-speaking sample, infants averaged 421 vocalizations per hour. Yeah, and background sounds were associated with reductions in infant vocalizations. Specifically, infants vocalize on average in 55% of intervals without background sound, compared to 46% of infant intervals with background sound, which is a difference of 9%. And you'll see that's relatively stable across both of the samples. And then this is just the differences in percentages for individual infants. So the proportion of intervals without background sound that had infant vocalizations minus the proportion of intervals with background sound that had infant vocalizations. So these are increased vocalizations in the absence of background sounds, and these are increased vocalizations in the presence of background sounds.
So Emily P, sorry, before Emily G, before this meeting, Emily P just sent me was saying this is really relevant for my fellowship. Should we ask Kathy to be a collaborator, which by the way is a great idea. But out of interest, so Emily P's doing this fellowship proposal on, I mean, you explain what it's about, Emily P, for those of you who don't know, but what would you predict you'd find for this?
So I predict that you'd get less infant vocalizations where there's more background noise.
So the effect, the bars would be green but higher.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, so they find what I'm predicting, yeah. But I think they're probably hypothesizing a different mechanism to the one I am. Right.
I don't know, we can get onto that. So are you going to talk about the mechanism, Emily G?
I don't think so. No. I mean, what's interesting to me is that there are infants who vocalize more when there's background sounds, and I guess that could be to do with like interactive toys, if they did code them when they make a sound, or music. But they haven't gone into which type of background sounds associate with higher or lower levels of vocalizations, maybe because they didn't have enough.
But overall, they find that more background noise is associated with less vocalizing, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's just the red ones that are more background noise and more vocalizations.
But that could just be sampling everywhere. I mean, it's a very, it could just be that. So, yeah, so just quickly on this, you might have stuff coming out that's more relevant to this, but I would predict that you'd find a different relationship for this over longer time scales. So I definitely noticed with my kids that when you turn the nights off, when you reduce external stimulation, they have this, Mike Goldstein calls it an extinction burst. So that it's the same with the still face. So he talks about it in the still face, that when you suddenly stop interacting, then they will then immediately increase how much they're like generating. And it's because they're used to having a particular amount of activity in the system. There's a used to a lot going on, and then suddenly when you switch off all the stimulation from the environment, they then start self-generating more stuff to compensate, to get the kind of total level of activity. But that's exactly the opposite of what would be predicted here. But that's probably at a more coarse grained time scale. Maria, you'd think about that, would you? What would you'd predict that too, would you?
Yeah, and I'm gonna work with noise, but it would be interesting to see if it's noise as background noise or generated by like potentially social agents like other people. Yeah.
But it'd also be nice to know like about these vocalizations, like if there's more noise, do infants like have to vocalize louder? Do they get used to that, or?
Yeah, I feel like there's like loads of further analyses that they could do here, isn't there, with like the different types of vocalizations and like the different types of background noises, etc. Yeah. Okay, so they said that a breakdown of background sound types revealed significant reductions in infant vocalizations for most of the categories of background noises. So for multiple sounds, television, screens, music, radio, and appliances, and infants vocalized to the same degree during intervals of silence and intervals with transportation construction and communication devices. And then in the English-speaking sample, on average, mothers produce 874 utterances per hour. Background sounds were associated also with reductions in mother speech. Mothers vocalize on average in 76% of intervals without background speech compared to 68% of intervals with background sound. A small but significant difference of 8%, which is similar to the infants. And then 26 of 36 mothers spoke more to their infants in the absence than in the presence of background sounds. Okay, and then here the percentage of intervals with television and screen sounds in which the mother talked was lower than the percentage of silence intervals with mother speech, whether or not the mother or the infant or both were watching the television or screen. So it didn't seem to matter whether anybody was paying attention to the screen on how much the mothers vocalized, which I thought it is not really very intuitive. Okay, then the Spanish-speaking sample, 40 mothers and infants, participants predominantly of Mexican descent, with some from Ecuador, Guatemala, US, Puerto Rico, and these are lower socioeconomic status. And then this is their kind of breakdown. I just put on the next slide the English speaking sample next to it. So I think what's interesting is that roughly the shape of the samples are similar, but the proportion of television or screen is much higher in the Spanish speaking sample.
What did they say in the paper about people putting it on more for the English speaking parents turning the telly off when they were being filmed?
They didn't say that at all. They didn't mention that at all. They didn't kind of draw any kind of cultural or Spanish speaking or socioeconomic class references. They just said that actually looking between the two samples just highlights that there's individual variability in the different households and what infants are exposed to. Yeah.
Sorry,
Yeah.
Emily, but the English speaking sample is the same ages because the Mexican I think in the previous slide was 8 to 24 months, if I'm not wrong. 25 months. Was the English one the same age range?
I think it was similar, yeah. And I think what they did, I don't know if I put it in the presentation at the beginning, but they've taken like random time points, like 3 random time points, and then sampled infants at 3 random time points within that spread. We can check.
Emily. Oh, sorry, I'll wait till after you're done this.
So like here, yeah, infants were seen within 1 week of turning 13 months, 18 months, or 23 months. So they're older here actually.
Cool. But then there are also 8 months old
Mm,
and 25 months old.
mm.
I was just wondering because maybe the Spanish sample is older, or which would make more sense for more cartoons or something, and the British one is just younger, but maybe I'm just trying to just the unjustifiable.
Yeah, I don't know, I don't know. Yeah. I don't know. Maybe. Ishul, did you have a question?
I think it's Candy.
Sorry, I have a question.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, so were there any I guess questionnaire about how often they watch television at home? Because I know like when some people are coming in for mine, like they're 12 months old or something, and the mom's like, oh, this is gonna be such a treat because we just don't have any television in front of them until they're 2. And that seems to be a common enough thing for the participants coming in, at least to the lab for my study so far. And so is there like a general no TV until they're 2, which is kind of some of the recommendations?
Yeah, no, they didn't ask that. And I think yeah, I just always think there's a difference between what people say to us and what they do when they're being filmed and what they do in real life as well. So here for the Spanish speaking sample, the most common types of background sound were television screen sounds. They also make the point that actually the range is very similar between the two cohorts, that the ones at the bottom are really getting like not a lot, and then the ones at the top are getting more. There's maybe like a bit more here in this kind of range. Yeah. And then after TV, music, radio, sounds, which were present in 34 homes for an average of 13% of intervals. Transportation, construction sounds were less prevalent, 9% of all intervals in 37 homes, and all but 6 participants experienced sounds from appliances, averaging 8% of intervals. And 24 participants were exposed to sounds from communication devices, which were rare. And then last, all but 2 participants experienced multiple sounds simultaneously, which was 7% of intervals across the sample. So the exploratory breakdown of the TV and screen and music sounds. TV and screen primarily were children's shows, followed by adult directed shows and commercials, so similar to the English speaking sample. Of the intervals with sounds from television screen, mothers watched about 1/3 of the time and talked about what was happening in 6%, which was lower than the English speaking sample. Infants watched about half the time, which is slightly lower than the English speaking sample, and dyes watched together 11% of the time. So it seems like here they're having the TV on in the background, whereas in the English speaking sample, if it's on, they're engaging with it. And then music was generally child directed with lyrics. Mothers rarely sang along or played instruments. So infants vocalized 198 times per hour. And background sounds were associated with reductions in infant vocalizations. Specifically, infants vocalized on average in 36% of intervals without background sound, compared to 30% of intervals with background sound, a small but significant difference of 6%, so similar to the other sample. There were more vocalizations in the absence versus presence of background sounds. Yeah. Okay, and significant reductions in infant vocalizations during multiple background sounds, television screens, and music and radio. Infants vocalized to the same degree during intervals of silence and intervals with appliances, transportation, construction, and communication devices. So I think transportation and construction is the only difference between the two groups. The percentage of intervals with television screen sounds in which the infant vocalized was lower than the percentage of silence intervals with infant vocalizations, whether or not a mother or the infant or both were watching. And the percentage of intervals with music in which the infants vocalized was lower than the percentage of silence intervals with infant vocalizations, whether the mother sang or played an instrument.
And Emily, you might have said this, but are they taking out like cry vocalizations there? It's just like actual vocalization, or is it cry vocalizations too?
Non-distress vocalizations.
Right, okay.
Yeah. I don't think I did say it, but it is. And then on average, the Spanish-speaking sample mothers produced 507 utterances per hour. Okay. So increased speech by mothers in the absence of background sounds, and then significant reductions to mother speech for multiple sounds, TV screens, music, radio, appliances, and transportation construction sounds. Mothers vocalized to the same extent during intervals with communication devices and silence. The kind of findings about the communication device are also surprising to me. Yeah, but maybe that's like Tom's point in kind of how they're being used. But I would have thought that communication devices would have had an effect on the amount of vocalizations. But there we go. And then this is
It's not when they're texting though, is it?
They will.
No, they wouldn't put that up because they've only done it off the audio.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I guess it would be like if you had your keypad tones on when you were texting, then it would be included, and if not, it wouldn't. I don't know. So when they pooled the results, most of the findings were the same. Background sounds were associated with reductions in infant vocalizations. Infant vocalized in just less than half of intervals without background sound, compared to just under 40% of intervals with background sound. So the difference was 8%. And then the pooled effect for transportation, construction, sounds indicated a decrease in infant vocalizations not seen in either sample separately. Background sounds were associated with reductions in mother speech. Mothers vocalized on average in 64% of intervals without sound, compared to 58% of intervals with sound, a significant difference of 6%. Breakdowns of background sound revealed significant different reductions in mother speech for all categories except communication devices. So yeah, here is where they start talking about the variation within the different homes, and they talk about the unique sound signatures of individual homes ranging from nearly constant background sounds to the occasional phone ringing to the intermittent honking of vehicles. I just really like that sentence. I don't know why. And they said most homes contained multiple co-occurring background sounds at least some of the time. Variation in infants' experience with background sounds derived from natural home observations extend the focus beyond television screens and cell phones. Oh yeah, and here they make the point that when they went, only the mother and infant were present, which is different from how we've done it. And presumably in everyday life, homes are filled with even more competing background sounds with other family members or visitors and whatnot, which if you think about the decibel reading going up to 77 perhaps means that in a kind of a normal day where there's not people videoing you, that the sound levels are getting, you know, very, very high. Yep, and here they make the points that I've already made, that variability was the main characteristic of infants' experience, and yeah, although infants from the Hispanic Spanish-speaking sample experience background sounds in the majority of the time, their range of total background sound exposure was as large as the range seen in the home of infants from the non-Hispanic middle socio-economic status households. And then they said, in fact, some English learning infants in middle income homes experienced much more background sound than did the Spanish learning infants in low income homes, and vice versa. Likewise, vocalization rates per hour differed wildly among infants from both samples, and also mother vocalizations as well. And importantly, associations between background sound and language exchange were virtually the same in samples 1 and 2. So English learning infants were still affected by noise, despite evidence suggesting that Spanish learning infants, who presumably are dual language learners, they're all living in America, have difficulty with sound exposure. And the only difference in the pattern of results across samples pertains to an infrequent category, i.e. appliances were associated with a reduction of infant vocalizations in sample 1, but not in sample 2. So they refrain from making inferences about sample differentiations. And furthermore, any differences between samples could not be attributed to home language alone, because samples also differed in terms of ethnicity, education, and socioeconomic status. Instead, our approach focused on within-group variability and the extent to which patterns of associations between background sound and language interactions generalize across widely different populations. And then the kind of main finding was that background sounds may interfere with real-time language interactions. And across dyads from both samples, 74% showed fewer infant vocalizations and 66% fewer maternal utterances in the presence of background sounds.
Is that wholly negative?
Well, I mean, it is. Do you mean the reduction in vocalizations and the interruption to real-time language interaction?
Yeah, is that the inference?
I mean, they don't really go into that. I guess their point is just that it could be negative if you're having too much background sound too much of the time, because, you know, there's all those stats about, I think they make the point about the amount of, this is only 1 hour or 2 hours out of the day. So they make the point that over the whole day, if you extrapolated that up, it would be significant, but you don't know what's going on across the whole day because you're only taking this 1 hour sample. But the fact that both samples were taken on 2 separate days in the English speaking group kind of indicates that the background noise is stable. And I guess from there you could make the inference that it is, you know, that if they are going to be exposed to less language and less interactions, which would obviously have knock-on effects.
Yeah, but and what about if I like engaged less, but I was more like, you know, present about what I was engaging with? So I commented and I spoke to my child about the background noises and explained to them all these different things. But I suppose it's mostly television, so
Yeah, I mean, that's what I thought
talked to them about what was on the radio and talked to them about what was on the telly. It was a bit more contingent than me just kind of, you know, filling the void with noise.
Is that is that like your definition of normal conversation,
No,
Ira?
no, I was just
But
wondering.
I guess that was my thought about what is happening here. The dyads that are speaking more when there is background noise is that maybe they are interacting about what the background noise is. So they're talking about, they're singing along to the music, or they're talking about something on the TV. Although we know in general that, you know, didn't happen, maybe in these instances like it did, but I don't know. I don't know the answer to your question, basically.
It's interesting too. Oh, sorry.
There you go.
No, I was just going to say it's interesting too that they decided to look at like mum and infant. I mean, probably won't make that much difference, but that they've looked at mum and infant vocalizations rather than looking at like vocal contingency, right? Because then you could make more kind of kind of conclusions about like communication rather than just whether they're vocalizing or not, I suppose.
Yeah, if you had like another measure for like turn taking.
Yeah, which they
Yeah.
could do easily here because they're not doing it automatically, are they?
Yeah, I mean, I guess that they didn't, I'm not clear whether they time stamped the mum and the infant vocalizations. So maybe they just had like a small budget for coding, which is why they only coded, because they recorded both hours, right, for the Spanish speaking sample, and then they just say, oh, we coded hour one, they don't say why. So maybe they just had a small budget for coding, and then they didn't do any kind of the temporal coding. But I don't know, that speculation.
Yeah, I know that makes sense. I think I remember because we did a conference with them ages ago. I think I remember them talking about this and them talking about how it's taking ages and ages for them to code, but that might be something else. But it would make sense if it was this.
Yeah.
It's in data view
Yeah.
takes age.
Yeah, they could do this.
But with data view, you get the timestamp, so probably they do have the timestamps.
Yeah, they would have done it without coding if you said, because they coded the non-speech vocalizations and they coded all the return utterances, so it shouldn't have cost anything to do it.
Yeah.
So theoretically, I mean, I think the bit that's missing from this is if I just screw up in a completely silent environment, you know, where there's no stimulation and nothing to look at, then it seems clear that my overall rate of vocalizations would be lower. Yeah. So this does strike me, as I was saying earlier, as a differential. Yeah. So I'm used to being in a noisy environment, and then in a moment of silence, yeah, I will, you know, this is consistent with Marta's hypothesis, consistent with Maria's hypothesis. If I'm used to a high level of background stimulation, yeah, moment when the world suddenly goes silent, I will produce a vocalization in order to increase my level of stimulation or to start off an interaction, yeah. But they don't seem to talk about that at all, this thing that if I look over longer timescales, I don't know, my prediction is I'd find exactly the opposite pattern, yeah. At times when there's more generally going on in your life, you vocalize more. I mean, that's what fits with our arousal findings. So you vocalize more when you're aroused, yeah, when there's more generally going on. So what do you think about that? I mean, we found vocalization correlates with arousal. Yeah, sorry, a background noise correlates with arousal, and arousal correlates with vocalizations. Yeah, so we've kind of not directly shown it, but we could have shown it over a larger time scale. You get exactly the opposite finding.
Can I say something? I guess it's important to distinguish between what type of a stimulus is like a noise, like a chaotic sound, versus a sound that is intriguing and engaging. If that makes sense.
Or even just familiar.
Like for instance, music can bring you to a good like above intermediate state of arousal that can bring you to a more engaging level, but maybe noise can bring it to a higher arousal, which is not good for interacting with the external world, if that makes sense. So I think they didn't really specify the mechanism of these noise in the background. Like to what extent is a noise intended to bring one's attention to a certain state, in this case, music is a good example, but construction noise is something distracting. So I think we should also distinguish between those, I guess.
Yeah, that's true too. Yeah.
I mean, like, I guess like if you're having like a highly stimulating environment, you're vocalizing more in the silences, and then you have a lower stimulating environment, you're vocalizing maybe less, but maybe more over time, like less vocalizations in every minute, but more like minutes where you're vocalizing.
Well, I'm not sure why you'd predict that. So I'm just thinking like times when, you know, on a Sunday afternoon here since we moved to Lewes, yeah, we've got a garden, and there's quite often times when, you know, Freddie's just sitting on a swing, you know, under a tree, and it's very quiet, and we're doing our stuff, and he won't talk for, you know, half an hour because he's just in a very relaxed, calm, quiet state. Yeah. That's the type of thing I'm thinking about. Whereas if there's
Yeah.
a lot going on, then that would, over a larger time scale, you know, if you look, you know, like 2-hour periods where there's more noise, he will be more excited, so he'll be vocalizing.
Yeah. But that's like Freddie's older now, isn't he? Like if you think about when I just remember when Mia was small, like I don't tend to have like a music on or the TV, and I would just talk to her like probably too much. But like yeah, I wouldn't have the burstiness that, but it would be kind of just a constant chatter about what I was doing. So I don't know.
Yeah, it's interesting. And then the other thing, sorry, back to so Emily Phillips. So basically, the hypothesis for her fellowship is kind of children with atypical kind of processing of kind of sensory information, yeah, will experience higher levels of kind of arousal in response to background stuff, yeah, and as a result of that, that will disrupt their social coordination with interactive partners, yeah. So I basically, there's a lot going on, I get overstimulated, that disrupts my social coordination, yeah. So surely what is not clear why, based on that, you would predict that I'd be more likely, I suppose, what the knockdown effect of how likely I am to talk when there's stuff going on would be higher. I've been thinking about the knock-up effect, yeah? I'm more likely to vocalize during moments of silence through this self-calibration mechanism. Is that what you meant earlier, Emily, when you were saying about you predict the same thing for different reasons, yeah?
Yeah, because
So
it's like the opposite, yeah.
Yeah, I'd predict you'd vocalize more during silence because you're trying to upregulate, yeah? I'm suddenly a bit understimulated, so I'm trying to make my environment more stimulated. Whereas you'll say you'll vocalize less when there's a lot of background noise coming on because I'm overwhelmed and I can't process it.
Yeah.
Okay.
But because at first I had it a high, like when I had the hypo hypothesis in as well, then I suppose I had that was the mechanism that I was gonna test as well, like where there's less noise, do they upregulate themselves? And then where there's more noise, they're downregulating themselves, and both might have, might disrupt interactions, I suppose. But yeah, but now I've only got one because it's just a bit tricky to test. But yeah, and kind of whether they're kind of flipping out or regulating themselves, I suppose, by not acting on their environment as much. Yeah.
And this is a bit random, but in when we are testing the solo play in BO1 in Birkbeck, it happens often the opposite, that there is a lot of noise when we are setting and putting the toys, and as soon as we close the door, the baby just shuts down and doesn't want to interact with the toys or stops vocalizing because it's too quiet. And then when we come back, they start like talking again and interacting. So maybe when it's too extreme, it also has the opposite effects. But this is a very like specific observation, but maybe there is something.
Yeah, and I suppose in like real, I don't know, in the home environment, it's very rare. I don't know, linked to what Sam was saying, that you get a moment where you go from high stimulation to nothing, like very low stimulation. Apart from maybe at night time, but yeah.
Just on that, sorry, did I cut you out there, Emily? Were you still saying something there, Emily?
No.
Okay, just on like Marty's point, though, I guess that because we also see the same thing. Well, I think that we see the same thing in our playpen. When solo play, they can go just very, very quiet all of a sudden, and in fact, they can kind of just like totally shut down. But I guess in another way, it is quite stimulating in the way that it's like very unpredictable, an environment for them in a way, like in terms of everything being like really new or being in this weird like playpen with like 2 stacks of toys next to them. So maybe it's like still the case that it's like stimulation, but just in terms of it being unpredictable rather than it being like a sensory thing.
But is it stimulation or a sense of feeling safe? Like if they were alone in the room, like maybe they were feeling a bit scared.
Yeah,
And
I
so
mean
that-
the reason they'd be scared is because it's unpredictable, and like if it's unpredictable, then it's like informational, and like in that way it's stimulating. So I would say it's like the same thing in a way.
Yeah, and then just before we finish, so Maria, how does this fit on? Because you've got your things which are, when I'm understimulated, I upregulate, and when I'm overstimulated, I downregulate, right? Which this fits into, fine.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
But then what's your stuff about social? Because you're testing for social interaction. How neatly does that fit in? So you're testing the idea that I use social interaction to upregulate, when my environment's calm, or
I think, we need to think more about it, but it will be comparing in 2 moments, like when they are in more social versus non-social moments, and maybe then we will find, a difference.
What difference would you predict that they'd upregulate? Would it be the same thing that they'd upregulate when understimulated and downregulate when overstimulated?
Maybe when they are in non-social moments, makes more sense to tend to sample or do what will maintain them in the state they are, while when they are in a more social, because they are not alone, there's another agent involved, then try to go to the optimal by sampling the opposite. I don't know, I need to read more about this, but something like that.
Yeah, and we don't really doesn't talk about, it's all about this paper, about downregulating when you're overstimulated as well. Yeah.
But it's interesting because it is contextual, like both models make sense. It's just a thing of, realizing which context which happen.
Interesting. Anyone got anything more to say? Emily said to go to pick up Mia. No? All right then. Well, she give her a round of applause anyway, even though she's not here. Very nice to present. All right, bye guys. See you tomorrow.
Bye.